This is Donovan, and I'm going to read part 2, chapter 4, Sex and Sacrament. This part 2 is about issues dealing with aspects of the body, and this particular chapter deals with chronic pain, illness, and God's untamable grace. This is a revision of something I posted earlier, which has since been deleted. Just as breathing, laughing, and crying can be whole-bodied prayers in which our whole self, mind, spirit, and body expresses and experiences the divine mystery, so even the experience of chronic illness can be experienced as sacramental, a means of grace that deepens our understanding of the suffering of others and the compassion of God through the experience of our whole self, body and mind. Mystics Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen, and Teresa of Avila all lived not only through plagues and violent political upheavals, but also with chronic, debilitating, excruciating pain that periodically disabled them completely. Yet each of them writes rich prayers of gratitude for the ways this pain deepened her intimacy with the divine, through her growing understanding of Jesus' suffering and the suffering of all other people. Each one of them expressed this grace that grew in them through their pain in extensive compassionate service, teaching, writing, tending others who were sick, and feeding others who were hungry. In our own chronic suffering, and or our helplessness as loved ones suffer so, how can we move from our understandable fear and anger toward a view that even in chronic suffering, we may still connect with God's infinite grace? Chronic mental illness, especially in its most difficult to treat forms, can be one of the most spiritually challenging experiences of such suffering, both for the one that's suffering personally and for those who love and care for that person. If we can learn to see God's grace working to sustain and heal communities and individuals, even through this controversial and often stigmatized human experience of mental illness, perhaps we can deepen and broaden our understanding of how God's grace may be experienced in almost any kind of illness or chronic pain. And here I want to add a trigger warning. I'm about to share a vision in prayer that's relevant to this topic, but it does include graphic description of mass violence. It's again something I saw in a vision, but it's related to an actual historic event. So you may want to stop the video here. All right. 5 days before the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, our Nigerian-born pastor tearfully invited our congregation of Christian pacifists that I was part of at the time to pray for 11 Nigerian brethren who had been shot to death during worship a week earlier. This was in December of 2012. I'd been living with a serious mental health diagnosis myself for about 15 years at that time, and although it later turned out to be a faulty diagnosis, my treatment at this time when I had this vision in prayer, included several psychiatric medications. So as we lifted our African faith community in prayer in 2012, my mind was overwhelmed with unbidden mental images of bullets spraying and falling, wounded children and adults, an altar, terrified worshipers scattering, ducking, and crawling, sounds of stifled screams and sobbing grief. Horrified, I blinked my eyes and shook my head and focused on the words of our prayers, hoping to clear these images and sounds from my conscious mind. As I closed my eyes again to pray, as if I were myself the gunman moving steadily, firmly, and purposefully toward the worshipers nearest the altar, I saw the bullets spraying in front of me as if they were only inches away, coming from a gun in my own hands, aimed at the worshipers for whom in real life I was trying to pray with all my heart. But in my mind's eye, I saw falling, screaming, and looking toward me in terror, as if I were the one shooting to kill them, ruthlessly careless of their lives. In real life, I again opened my eyes in shock and shook my head, trying to focus on my pastor's voice and words as she prayed. But even with my eyes wide open and her words of prayer in my ears in real life, I could smell burnt metal, as in my mind's eye I saw blood splattered on the floor and walls and altar of a small church, and continued to hear the shrieking and crying of women and children. I urgently and repeatedly pleaded with God in silence, horrified and frightened to make these images stop, protesting that I was already praying for our African loved ones with compassion, that I didn't need to see this brutal violence firsthand when I could do nothing to prevent it, so far away in time and space from these events of the past week. Yet again, as if from the eyes of the gunmen, I saw their suffering in my mind's eye, and I felt sick and scared. I asked God, why? I cried, powerless to stop it. And why wasn't I seeing from the eyes of those I was praying for, the fallen, the wounded, the innocent? I shook my head once again, hoping to remove these images from my sight and memory, with hot tears burning my eyes, and heard a womanly voice answer in my mind's eye, or in my mind's ear. Because this too is my beloved child. A lump rose in my throat. I felt ashamed, nauseous, horrified. My insanity had taken me too far. How could this be right? What kind of God could this be? What kind of message was this? And how could I, at that time a pastor and teacher of Christianity myself, ever dare to tell anyone that while my brethren pastor, herself born in Nigeria, tearfully prayed for these Christian martyrs, God wanted me to learn to love not only the innocent martyrs, but even their murderer, as God did? To see not only the victims, but also the gunmen who massacred innocent and defenseless children and adults who died in terror, as God's own beloved child? 5 days after this revelation that even such a person is God's own beloved child, another lone gunman shot 20 more defenseless children and 6 adults to death at Sandy Hook Elementary School, this time in my own home country. Pain, suffering, and boundless grace. Why should we even try to hold them together in situations like this? Of course, I'm just a human being. I don't have an answer to that question. This is a small meditation that follows subsection. There's no more violence, graphic violence after that last part. This is called casting out fear and other communal responses to chronic mental illness. This vision and prayer expressed a truth that divine grace and love are so boundless and untamable that they embrace everyone, even those we judge or fear. Although many religious communities tend to stigmatize and isolate those we fear, the divine example embodied by Jesus and other spiritual teachers is one of boundless love. When religious communities treat chronic and or serious mental illness by denying it exists at all, or denying that it could include aspects of physical illness rather than exclusively being caused by sin or moral failure, or conversely, when we demand that it should somehow be permanently cured by any combination of faith and medical intervention, we ignore or minimize the reality of mental illness as a thorn in the flesh that doesn't just go away, in spite of the sincere prayers and other forms of intervention by many who do live with it. No matter who you are or how you pray, mental illness can sometimes be intermittent, cyclical, and or chronic. Some chronic mental illnesses are especially difficult to manage, even with medication, therapy, and rehabilitation combined. And in such cases, when communities of faith and spiritual teachers push false hope, empty promises, or threatening pressures for a permanent cure of the mental illness, we only deepen the despair of families and individuals who, for whatever reason, experience such cure only intermittently or perhaps not at all. So, if we want to respond more graciously and compassionately to those living with such illnesses, then we must first recognize that fear and hostility alone are not the only appropriate reactions to those who are mentally ill. In fact, I hope a community of faith doesn't want to respond with hostility. In spite of disproportionate media attention to certain types of crimes and certain individuals that might make us feel fearful. Very few mentally ill people overall, in fact, the same proportion as in the general population, ever commit violent crimes. Violent behavior towards others is seldom related to mental illness unless that illness is exacerbated by outside factors. Doctors report that the vast majority of people who are violent do not suffer from mental illnesses. When violent mass shootings like Columbine or Sandy Hook occur, not by a serial killer, not connected to domestic or gang violence, nor motivated by a political agenda, then at least half of those perpetrators do show signs of serious mental problems, including either a hospitalization, a prescription for psychiatric drugs, a suicide attempt, or evidence of psychosis. So again, that's saying when there are other explanations when someone is connected with a gang or a domestic terrorist group or has a political agenda. That's different than what we're talking about now. Only when someone doesn't have connection to only any of those things and still does this type of behavior, then at least half the time, yes, that individual might have a mental health history of some sort. But in the US, such attacks are much less than 1%, much less than 1% of all homicides. So most of those homicides have those other things involved. And in recent times, the last 4 years, I don't think we should be surprised that domestic terrorist groups and gangs, using that term very loosely, political agendas, those things contribute a lot more than mental illness to these type of homicides. So risk factors other than mental illness are at least equally significant contributors to such crime in the US. And I'm just talking about the US because for one reason we have more of these mass shootings than any other culture, but the resources I'm drawing from are different federal statistics that I'll put in the sources cited in the video description. So risk factors other than mental illness are at least equally significant contributors to such crime in the US. For people with mental illnesses, violent behavior appears to be more common when there's also the presence of other risk factors that include substance use or dependence, a history of violence, juvenile detention, physical abuse, recent stressors such as being a crime victim themselves, getting divorced, or losing a job. Most of these risk factors that contribute to US violent crime can cause trauma, which highlights the need for trauma recovery to be a part of violence prevention and communal care. So again, that's where communities of faith might be able to step in a meaningful way. People with mental health issues are most often not violent toward others at all. People with psychiatric disabilities are far more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violent crime. Specifically, people with severe mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or psychosis are 2.5 times more likely to be attacked, raped, or mugged than the general population. So for people of faith, instead of reflexive exclusion of those with mental illnesses from our communal life focusing on our own imagined self-protection, a more effective and more compassionate response would be not only to include, but to reach out with care and concern to people who have chronic illnesses, including mental health issues, as people who are especially vulnerable to violence in our communities. As the Bible teaches, in there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. That's 1 John 4:18. If we care about peacemaking, reconciliation, and compassion, we need to be especially concerned about the generally negative social attitudes that are directed at and internalized by those who have chronic mental health issues. Stigmatizing those who have mental health issues has medical, practical, and social consequences for all of us, but especially for those most vulnerable. Stigma leads others to avoid living, socializing, or working with, renting to, or employing people with mental disorders, especially severe disorders such as schizophrenia. It leads to low self-esteem, isolation, and hopelessness. Again, when I say it, I'm not talking about mental health, I'm talking about the stigma is what leads to the hopelessness and low self-esteem and the isolation. It deters people from seeking and wanting to pay for care. Responding to stigma, people with mental health problems internalize public attitudes and become so embarrassed or ashamed that they often conceal symptoms and fail to seek treatment. The stigma most of us have about chronic illness and mental health drives us apart, divides us, and pushes out people who need community most. As a result of this stigma, Americans are hesitant to interact with people who have mental illnesses. Studies show that 38% of us are unwilling to be friends with someone having mental health difficulties. 64% of Americans do not want someone who has schizophrenia as a close coworker, and more than 68% of Americans are unwilling to have someone with depression marry into their family. Even in communities of faith where people hope to find and express emphasis on grace, compassion, and healing, members often have some fear and awkwardness around a person who has mental illness. We need to admit that any such fears come not from the source of all love and truth, whatever that is for you, but I call it whatever. This I had capitalized the source of all love and truth. So that's not the source of our fear, right? The source of love is not the source of our fear, but rather those fears come from the wider culture's stereotypes about people with mental illness. While some of our fears in or out of faith communities may seem justified in some ways, still, we must recognize that few people with mental illness, few people with mental illness overall will ever commit these violent crimes. And more importantly, our call to share God's unbounded grace and love with others is unconditional. To live with mercy and compassion, for some to follow the way of Jesus, is to recognize the humanity and God-belovedness of all people. God's perfect love casts out fear, even our fears. One stumbling block to this perfect love may be that some of us have an unreasonable expectation that connection to spirit means that we'll always experience unlimited, uninterrupted joy and peace. When we remember that the Psalms and wisdom, like the books of Job and Jonah, include lament, and that our spiritual leaders in many different traditions around the world through history have shared dark nights of the soul, we can let go of that false expectation of constantly being on a pink cloud of joy with untroubled serenity, and we can have compassion for our own struggles with those moods and feelings, then better embody godly compassion toward those who struggle with chronic illnesses, especially those who may struggle with mental or mood disorders. Some of us might also push away those who look to the community of faith for help um, when they're struggling with suicidal depression, for example, out of a fear that those who die of suicidal depression are damned by God to everlasting torture and destruction. Instead of responding with fear, perfect love reminds us that the Creator of all graciously understands and loves unconditionally those whose struggles are beyond our own comprehension or help. When we fail to express this boundless love and grace to those who experience chronic pain, not only have we departed from God's own example, but we may, even unintentionally, contribute to those very rare cases where a person with mental illness and serious pain actually does lash out in violence. According to experts, cases of mass violence may have more to do with society's lack of knowledge of mental health issues rather than a lack of security. In case after case, family members, teachers, and mental health professionals missed or dismissed signs of deterioration. Research about these lone shooters points to something that should especially concern communities of faith about how well we're doing our job embodying beloved community. All of these mass shooters, these lone gunmen, shared one remarkable characteristic that set them vastly apart from the typical American murderer. Unlike the great majority of other violent criminals who are not mentally ill, not one of these mass shooters actually tried to get away with the crime. This group is largely suicidal. Nearly all lone gunmen in mass shootings end up killing themselves or seeking what's often called death by cop, as police officers react to prevent further violence. Kay Redfield Jamison, a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine who also has bipolar disorder herself, explains, you can see someone who's morbidly depressed for a long time, and they have a suicide plan in place. But the timing is determined by impulse. The link between suicide and homicide is a very real one, and it hasn't been studied nearly enough. It has always struck me about Columbine. People forget they committed suicide, and that's understandable. It was the least important thing from the public point of view. Researching a detailed database of as many such crimes as could be discovered by searching news clippings in all 50 states, scientific papers, and other sources, experts agree that these individuals do not just suddenly snap. Most have long histories not only of mental illness, but also of failure and dislocation. This is especially important for communities of faith and spiritual practice because as communities, we have the opportunity to extend God's grace to those who are dislocated by such chronic illness. We have to let perfect love cast out any social fears we still have about preserving our status quo that cause us to stigmatize or exclude those who live with mental illnesses. Rather than ignoring or shaming people who struggle with suicidal thoughts or chronic mental illnesses, we can choose to express God's love by actively expressing compassion, listening in supportive silence, and just being community. By offering support to those who are suffering torment and isolation due to mental illness, our faith communities may even help to prevent these tragedies from occurring. Many people with mental illness in their families may have some anxieties and embarrassment about psychiatric and rehabilitative treatments. Instead of contributing to their uneasiness, we can discerningly but actively embrace treatment, including medical and therapeutic dimensions, as having implications for our shared faith life. And I'm talking about not stigma, but good implications. In the Christian tradition, this connection is explicit. The Latin word for healing, salus, is the root word for our English word, salvation. Writing of their own survival of suicide, even people who are not religious find this language best expresses their experience of recovery. For example, William Styron, the author of Sophie's Choice, described his own psychiatric hospitalization for suicidal depression not in medical terms, but rather as a salvation, a way station, a purgatory. The American poet John Berryman also writes of seeking salvation in a psychiatric ward and finding it as he listens to other patients, many of whom are in even greater distress than he is. So, if psychiatric treatment can lead to salvation like experiences of change and spiritual growth, as so many have experienced after suicide attempts or suicidal ideation, then as people of faith, we have no reason to fear supporting and participating in this particular mode of care, especially when the alternative, stigmatizing and excluding people with chronic illness from our faith communities, can be so very dangerous, not only to the person who's ill, but to all of us. So I'm going to pause there and I'll pick up the second half of the chapter later.